Welcome, fellow traveler of infinite realities, to the complete chronicle of Rick Prime, the most dangerous and twisted version of Rick Sanchez across all possible dimensions. Tonight, we explore the saga of a brilliant mind that chose abandonment over love, genocide over growth, and cosmic cruelty over human connection. Settle in comfortably and let your consciousness drift as we journey through the darkest corners of the multiverse. Following the path of a Rick who became everything that Rick C-137 feared he might become. There is no need to remember every detail. Simply let this story of genius corrupted by infinite possibility wash over you like portal fluid through space-time, carrying you toward peaceful rest as we uncover the origins of the multiverse's greatest monster. The Rick who would eventually become known across infinite dimensions as Rick Prime began his existence in circumstances nearly identical to every other version of Rick Sanchez throughout the multiverse. Brilliant beyond measure, married to a woman named Diane who possessed the rare combination of intelligence and patience necessary to love someone whose genius created as many problems as it solved, and father to a daughter named Beth, whose bright curiosity and unconscious trust in her father's capabilities provided the emotional grounding that kept his scientific obsessions tethered to human concerns and moral considerations. But from the very beginning, even during the early years when outside observers might have mistaken Rick Prime for just another gifted inventor, struggling to balance family responsibilities with intellectual pursuits that demanded increasingly large portions of his time and attention, there were subtle signs that this particular Rick possessed psychological characteristics that differentiated him from his countless alternate selves in ways that would eventually prove catastrophic for everyone whose lives intersected with his own across multiple realities. The marriage between Rick Prime and his Dimensions version of Diane was, from its earliest stages, characterized by fundamental incompatibilities that neither partner fully recognized or acknowledged until years of accumulated resentment and disappointment had created emotional barriers that no amount of good intentions or therapeutic intervention could successfully dismantle. Where other versions of Rick found in their relationships with Diane a source of emotional stability and intellectual stimulation that enhanced their scientific work while providing them with reasons to remain connected to normal human concerns and moral frameworks, Rick Prime experienced his marriage as a series of increasingly intolerable constraints on his autonomy and creative freedom. The subtle but persistent conflicts that marked Rick Prime's domestic life during this period were not the ordinary disagreements about priorities and responsibilities that affect most marriages between ambitious people with competing demands on their time and attention, but rather reflected deeper philosophical differences about the nature of commitment, obligation, and the relative importance of individual achievement versus collective welfare that would eventually prove impossible to resolve through compromise or mutual accommodation. Diane Prime possessed the same intelligence and emotional sophistication that characterized her alternate selves across other dimensions, but her attempts to maintain connection with a husband whose psychological development was following increasingly antisocial trajectories created forms of stress and disappointment that gradually eroded her capacity for the kind of patient, understanding and supportive encouragement that had sustained other versions of their relationship through difficult periods of adjustment and growth. Rick Prime's response to the ordinary challenges of marriage and parenthood revealed personality traits that his alternate selves had either learned to manage more successfully or had never developed to the same destructive degree. An inability to tolerate criticism or suggestions that implied his judgment might be flawed, a tendency to interpret requests for emotional availability as unreasonable demands on his time and energy, and a growing conviction that his intellectual superiority justified his dismissive attitude toward concerns that seemed trivial compared to the cosmic scope of his scientific investigations. The birth of Beth Prime should have provided Rick with the same transformative experience of protective love and expanded perspective that characterized other Rick's relationships with their daughters, but instead revealed the extent to which his capacity for normal, emotional bonding had already been compromised by years of increasing isolation within his own intellectual achievements and growing resentment toward anyone whose needs or expectations might interfere with his pursuit of ever more ambitious research projects. Where other Ricks found in fatherhood a source of meaning and motivation that gave their scientific work greater purpose by connecting it to the welfare of people they loved, Rick Prime experienced his parental responsibilities as additional evidence that ordinary human relationships were incompatible with the kind of unlimited intellectual exploration that his genius both enabled and demanded. The patience and attention that successful parenting required seemed to him like inefficient allocation of mental resources that could be better applied to problems of greater significance and lasting importance. The family routines that other Ricks had learned to navigate successfully, dinner conversations about Beth's school experiences, weekend activities that balanced family time with personal interests, holiday celebrations that created shared memories and reinforced emotional bonds, became for Rick Prime sources of irritation and psychological claustrophobia that he endured with decreasing grace and mounting resentment toward the Fane, people who expected him to participate in activities that seemed meaningless compared to the theoretical frameworks and experimental projects that occupied his thoughts during every moment when social obligations did not require him to simulate interest in trivial concerns. Rick Prime's workshop in the family garage gradually transformed from a space where he pursued scientific interests while remaining accessible to family members who wanted to understand his work or simply spend time in his presence, into an increasingly fortified retreat where he could escape from domestic demands and interpersonal expectations that interfered with his growing obsession with pushing the boundaries of what was scientifically and technologically possible, without regard for ethical considerations or practical limitations. The projects that Rick Prime pursued during the years when his marriage was deteriorating from mutual disappointment into active hostility reflected his evolution from someone who viewed science as a means of understanding and improving the world into someone who regarded knowledge and power as ends in themselves that justified any methods necessary for their achievement. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind that was systematically abandoning the humanitarian concerns and moral constraints that had previously provided direction and purpose for his intellectual capabilities. Diane Prime's attempts to address the growing distance and hostility in their relationship were met with responses that revealed the extent to which Rick had developed contempt, not just for her specifically, but for the entire framework of emotional needs and interpersonal obligations that normal human relationships required for their maintenance and growth. Her suggestions about counseling, vacation time, or other interventions designed to rebuild their connection were dismissed as evidence of her failure to understand the significance of his work or appreciate the sacrifices that genius required from everyone in its vicinity. The arguments that became increasingly frequent and bitter during the final years of Rick Prime's marriage were not the ordinary conflicts about money, parenting decisions, or time management that affect most couples under stress, but rather fundamental disagreements about the nature of love, commitment, and moral responsibility that revealed how completely Rick's intellectual development had divorced him from normal human values and emotional responses. Rick Prime's growing conviction that his intellectual superiority exempted him from the ordinary moral obligations that governed less gifted people's behavior was reinforced by his scientific achievements during this period, which provided him with concrete evidence of his exceptional capabilities, while also demonstrating his ability to solve problems and achieve goals that would have been impossible for anyone with normal human limitations. The theoretical breakthroughs that Rick Prime accomplished during his final years of family life laid the groundwork for the portal technology that would eventually enable his transformation from locally destructive husband and father into a cosmic-scale threat to the stability of infinite realities. But they also marked his psychological transition from someone who used science to serve human needs into someone who viewed other people as obstacles to be overcome or resources to be exploited in pursuit of ever more ambitious demonstrations of his own power and intelligence. The casual cruelty that Rick Prime began displaying toward Diane and Beth during this period was not the result of sudden personality change, but rather the gradual emergence of psychological characteristics that had always been present but had been previously constrained by social expectations, and his own investment in maintaining relationships that provided him with emotional stability and practical support. As his sense of intellectual superiority grew stronger and his commitment to family responsibilities grew weaker, the barriers that had prevented the expression of his more antisocial impulses gradually eroded until his behavior toward the people closest to him became indistinguishable from his treatment of strangers or enemies. The final months of Rick Prime's marriage were characterized by psychological warfare that went far beyond ordinary marital conflict into territory that approached systematic emotional torture designed to break down Diane's sense of self-worth and autonomy, while also demonstrating Rick's complete indifference to her welfare or happiness. His verbal attacks were not spontaneous expressions of anger or frustration, but calculated attempts to cause maximum psychological damage while avoiding the kind of overt physical violence that might have prompted intervention from outside authorities or social services. Rick Prime's treatment of Beth during this period revealed the full extent of his moral deterioration as he began using his daughter's love and dependence as weapons against her mother, while also conducting informal experiments on the child's psychological development that served no purpose beyond satisfying his curiosity about the effects of emotional manipulation on young minds. The inventions he created for Beth were not expressions of paternal affection, but rather tools for testing her responses to different forms of stimulation and control. The decision to abandon his family rather than continue enduring the constraints and obligations that marriage and parenthood imposed on his freedom was made with the same casual disregard for other people's welfare that Rick Prime brought to solving technical problems or pursuing research, objectives that interested him. The fact that his departure would cause profound emotional damage to people who loved and depended on him was not a consideration that carried any weight in his calculations about how to optimize his living situation for maximum personal convenience and intellectual productivity. But Rick Prime's abandonment of his family was not simply a selfish decision to prioritize his own interests over his responsibilities to others. It was also the first step in a systematic campaign of revenge against the entire concept of love and commitment that he had come to view as incompatible with the kind of unlimited intellectual and moral freedom that his genius both enabled and demanded. The hatred he felt for Diane was not just personal resentment against someone who had disappointed him, but rather philosophical opposition to everything she represented about human connection, emotional vulnerability, and the constraints that caring about others imposed on individual autonomy. The stage was set for Rick Prime's transformation from locally destructive family man into the multiverse's greatest monster. But the psychological foundation for that evolution had been established years earlier through choices and attitudes that gradually eroded his capacity for normal human empathy, while strengthening his conviction that his exceptional intelligence justified exceptional moral flexibility in pursuit of goals that transcended ordinary human understanding or approval. The years that Rick Prime spent developing teleportation technology were marked by the same obsessive focus and methodical brilliance that characterized all of his scientific pursuits, but they were also shaped by psychological motivations that went far beyond simple intellectual curiosity or desire to advance human knowledge and capability. The theoretical frameworks that he constructed during this period were not just mathematical abstractions designed to solve complex problems in physics and engineering, but also expressions of his growing conviction that the ordinary limitations of human existence, including geographical boundaries, physical constraints, and the slow pace of conventional travel, were obstacles that his superior intelligence should enable him to transcend completely. The workspace where Rick Prime conducted his teleportation research had evolved from the cluttered but functional garage laboratory where he had once pursued projects that served family interests and community needs into something approaching a fortress of solitude where he could escape from all forms of human contact and social obligation, while pursuing goals that were meaningful only to himself. The equipment he assembled there represented the most advanced technology available in his dimension, but it was also organized according to principles that prioritized efficiency and capability over safety or consideration for anyone who might be affected by his experimental procedures. Rick Prime's approach to teleportation research was characterized by the same casual disregard for ethical constraints and potential consequences that marked all of his scientific work during this period, as he conducted experiments that endangered not just his own safety, but also the welfare of anyone in the vicinity of his laboratory during tests of increasingly powerful and unstable prototype devices. The theoretical models he developed were elegant and mathematically sophisticated, but they were also based on assumptions about acceptable risk levels and collateral damage that revealed how completely his moral reasoning had been corrupted by his sense of intellectual superiority and personal invulnerability. The breakthrough that finally enabled Rick Prime to achieve practical teleportation technology came not through careful systematic research, but through a moment of reckless experimentation that nearly destroyed his entire laboratory while also providing him with the crucial insights necessary to stabilize the energy manipulation processes that made instantaneous transportation possible. The success was intoxicating not just because it represented a major scientific achievement, but also because it demonstrated his ability to succeed where conventional wisdom suggested that success was impossible or prohibitively dangerous. But the psychological impact of Rick Prime's teleportation breakthrough was overshadowed by his discovery that similar technology had already been developed by numerous other versions of himself across alternate dimensions, transforming what should have been a moment of triumph and validation into a crushing reminder that his achievements were not as unique or significant as he had assumed. The realization that he was not just late to the teleportation party, but was actually among the last Ricks to solve the problem represented a blow to his narcissistic self-image that was more devastating than any failure or setback he had previously experienced. The depression and rage that followed Rick Prime's discovery of his relative mediocrity in the field of teleportation research was not the ordinary disappointment that might affect any scientist who learned that colleagues had achieve similar results through independent investigation, but rather a form of existential crisis that threatened the entire foundation of his identity and self-worth. The conviction that his intellectual superiority made him special and important was so central to his psychological functioning that evidence of his ordinariness in any field created cognitive dissonance that he was not equipped to process through normal, emotional, and rational mechanisms. Rick Prime's response to learning that he was the last Rick to invent teleportation revealed the extent to which his sense of personal worth had become dependent on maintaining beliefs about his own uniqueness and superiority that could not survive honest comparison with the achievements of his alternate selves. The fury that consumed him was not just wounded pride, but also terror at the possibility that his entire sense of identity and purpose might be based on illusions that could be destroyed by objective evidence about his actual capabilities and significance. The decision to abandon teleportation research in favor of pursuing something that no other Rick had yet achieved was motivated not by rational assessment of which scientific problems might be most important or interesting to solve, but rather by desperate need to restore his sense of intellectual superiority through accomplishments that would distinguish him from his alternate selves in ways that could not be diminished by comparison or competition. The portal technology that became his new obsession was appealing not because of its potential applications or theoretical elegance, but because it represented an opportunity to be first at something that would matter on a cosmic scale. Rick Prime's work on interdimensional portal travel was conducted with an intensity and focus that exceeded even his previous levels of scientific obsession, as he poured every aspect of his intellectual and creative energy into solving theoretical problems that had never been seriously attempted by any Rick in any dimension. The mathematical frameworks he developed during this period were genuinely innovative and represented advances in theoretical physics that would have secured his reputation as one of the greatest scientific minds in his reality if he had chosen to publish his work through conventional academic channels. But Rick Prime's motivations for developing portal technology were never primarily scientific or humanitarian. They were personal and psychological, designed to restore his sense of superiority and uniqueness, while also providing him with capabilities that would enable him to transcend the ordinary limitations and constraints that confined other beings to single realities and finite possibilities. The power to travel between alternate dimensions represented not just technological achievement, but also a form of godhood that would place him in a category of existence that no other version of himself had yet achieved. The theoretical breakthroughs that enabled Rick Prime to crack the secrets of interdimensional travel required him to develop mathematical models of reality that were so complex and counterintuitive that they could only be understood by minds operating at the highest levels of human intellectual capability. But they also demanded a form of moral flexibility and willingness to accept dangerous consequences that revealed how completely his scientific work had become divorced from normal ethical considerations and humanitarian concerns. The construction of Rick Prime's first functional portal device was accomplished through experimental procedures that endangered not just his own safety, but also the structural stability of space-time itself within his local area, as he tested increasingly powerful energy manipulation techniques without adequate understanding of their potential effects on the fundamental laws of physics that governed reality in his dimension. The casual acceptance of these risks demonstrated his complete indifference to consequences that might affect other people, while also revealing his growing conviction that his scientific objectives justified any level of danger or potential destruction. The moment when Rick Prime successfully opened his first stable interdimensional portal was simultaneously the greatest achievement of his scientific career and the beginning of his transformation from a locally destructive individual into a threat to the welfare and safety of infinite populations across countless realities. The ability to travel between alternate dimensions provided him with access to resources, knowledge, and opportunities for experimentation that no single reality could contain, while also confirming his sense of intellectual superiority in ways that eliminated his remaining constraints against treating other beings as expendable resources in pursuit of his increasingly ambitious goals. The psychological impact of Rick Prime's breakthrough in portal technology was profound and immediate, as the ability to observe and interact with alternate versions of himself and everyone else he had ever known provided him with direct evidence of the infinite nature of existence, while also revealing the arbitrary nature of the limitations and obligations that had previously constrained his behavior within his original dimension. The recognition that infinite realities contained infinite variations of every possible experience made it psychologically easier for him to dismiss the significance of individual choices and relationships that had once seemed important and meaningful. Rick Prime's first explorations of alternate dimensions were conducted with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all of his research projects, but they were also shaped by psychological needs and emotional interests that had little to do with scientific curiosity or desire to understand the nature of reality. The realities he chose to visit were selected primarily for their potential to provide him with validation of his intellectual superiority, while also offering opportunities for experimentation and resource acquisition that would have been impossible within the ethical and practical constraints of his original dimension. The alternate Ricks that Rick Prime encountered during his early interdimensional travels revealed the full range of possible outcomes that his basic personality and intellectual capabilities could produce under different circumstances, with different choices, but they also confirmed his growing conviction that he had achieved something that none of his other selves had managed to accomplish. The ability to travel between realities made him unique among all versions of himself, providing him with the kind of distinction and superiority that his psychological needs required for stable functioning. But perhaps most importantly, Rick Prime's development of portal technology provided him with the means to escape from all forms of accountability and consequence that had previously limited his behavior within any single reality, as he could now abandon dimensions that became inconvenient or problematic, while seeking out alternate versions of people and situations that better served his interests and objectives. The power to treat entire realities as disposable resources represented the final step in his evolution from someone who was constrained by normal moral considerations into someone who was limited only by his own imagination and technological capabilities. The success of Rick Prime's portal technology project marked the end of his psychological development as recognizably human and the beginning of his existence as something that transcended normal categories of morality, accountability, while retaining enough connection to his original emotional patterns to make his subsequent choices maximally destructive to the people and relationships he had once cared about. The ability to travel between dimensions had given him godlike power, but it had also completed his transformation into the kind of being who would use that power to cause suffering on a scale that no single reality could contain. The transformation of Rick Prime from isolated genius pursuing personal scientific achievements into evangelical messenger of interdimensional possibility marked perhaps the most psychologically revealing phase of his evolution toward cosmic-scale monstrosity, as his need for validation and recognition drove him to seek converts to his technological gospel across infinite realities with the fervor of someone whose sense of identity had become completely dependent on external confirmation of his superiority and significance. The portal gun that had initially represented personal escape from the constraints and disappointments of his original dimension now became a recruitment tool designed to create a community of fellow travelers who would acknowledge his status as the pioneer and leader of multiversal civilization. Rick Prime's approach to interdimensional evangelism was characterized by the same methodical thoroughness and strategic thinking that had enabled his scientific breakthroughs, but it was also shaped by psychological needs that went far beyond rational interest in sharing beneficial technology with alternate versions of himself. The systematic way he identified and approached other Ricks across countless dimensions revealed his understanding that successful recruitment required not just demonstration of portal technology, but also careful assessment of each target's psychological vulnerabilities and motivational frameworks that could be exploited to secure their cooperation and allegiance. The dimensions that Rick Prime selected for his recruitment campaign were chosen not randomly, but according to criteria that reflected his sophisticated understanding of which realities would contain versions of himself most likely to respond positively to his offer of transcendence, while also providing him with the kinds of intellectual and emotional validation that his damaged psyche required for stable functioning. He avoided dimensions where alternate Ricks had already achieved similar technological breakthroughs, focusing instead on realities where his portal gun would represent a quantum leap in capability that could not be dismissed or minimized through comparison with local achievements. The presentation that Rick Prime developed for introducing portal technology to his alternate selves was carefully crafted to maximize its psychological impact, while minimizing opportunities for the kind of critical analysis that might reveal the personal motivations and psychological damage underlying his apparent generosity in sharing revolutionary scientific discoveries. The demonstration of interdimensional travel was designed to create immediate sense of awe and possibility that would overwhelm rational evaluation of potential costs and consequences, while his explanation of multiversal theory was structured to make rejection seem like evidence of intellectual inadequacy or moral cowardice. Rick Prime's opening gambit with each new Rick typically began with casual demonstration of capabilities that should have been impossible according to the target's understanding of physics and engineering, followed by revelation that these achievements were not unique accomplishments but rather routine applications of technology that Rick Prime had developed and was prepared to share with versions of himself who possessed sufficient intelligence and courage to embrace their true potential. The psychological manipulation inherent in this approach was sophisticated and effective, appealing simultaneously to intellectual curiosity, personal ambition, and fear of being left behind by more adventurous, alternate selves. The theoretical framework that Rick Prime used to explain portal technology and multiversal theory was not just scientifically accurate, but also philosophically seductive, presenting interdimensional travel not as mere transportation method, but as liberation from the arbitrary limitations and meaningless constraints that confined ordinary beings to single realities with finite possibilities. His description of the multiverse was designed to make continued existence within any single dimension seem like voluntary imprisonment that only the intellectually timid or emotionally dependent would choose to maintain when unlimited. Alternatives were readily available. Rick Prime's recruitment speeches were masterpieces of psychological warfare disguised as scientific education, as he presented the choice between accepting and rejecting portal technology as fundamentally a test of each Rick's capacity for growth and transcendence, rather than a practical decision about whether the benefits of interdimensional travel justified its potential risks and costs. The way he framed the offer made rejection seem like evidence of fear, intellectual limitation, or attachment to inferior forms of existence that were incompatible with the kind of unlimited potential that characterized truly superior minds. The reactions that Rick Prime encountered during his multiversal recruitment campaign ranged from immediate acceptance and enthusiastic collaboration to suspicious inquiry and careful evaluation to outright rejection based on moral objections or practical concerns. But in every case, his response revealed the extent to which his apparent generosity in sharing portal technology was actually motivated by desperate need for validation and recognition that could only be satisfied through successful conversion of other versions of himself to his worldview and lifestyle choices. The Ricks who accepted Rick Prime's offer of portal technology typically did so for reasons that aligned closely with his own original motivations: desire to escape from constraints and obligations that seemed incompatible with their intellectual capabilities, curiosity about possibilities that single realities could not provide, or attraction to the kind of power and freedom that interdimensional travel represented. Their enthusiasm for joining Rick Prime's multiversal community provided him with the validation and confirmation he needed, while also creating a network of allies and collaborators who could assist with increasingly ambitious projects that required resources and knowledge from multiple dimensions. But the Ricks who expressed interest in portal technology without immediately accepting Rick Prime's offer created psychological challenges that tested his ability to maintain the facade of disinterested scientific collaboration that he used to mask his desperate need for approval and acceptance. The questions they asked about potential consequences, ethical implications, and long-term effects of interdimensional travel forced him to develop increasingly sophisticated rationalizations for choices and behaviors that could not be adequately justified through simple appeals to intellectual curiosity or scientific progress. The most psychologically difficult encounters for Rick Prime were with alternate versions of himself who possessed sufficient intelligence to understand the theoretical basis for portal technology and adequate scientific knowledge to appreciate its significance, but who nonetheless chose to reject his offer based on moral considerations or personal priorities that prioritized family relationships and community obligations over individual transcendence and unlimited exploration. These Ricks represented everything that Rick Prime had abandoned and rejected, but their continued existence served as constant reminders of paths not taken and possibilities for different forms of meaning and purpose. Rick Prime's response to rejection varied depending on his assessment of each refusing Rick's motivations and reasoning. But in every case, the encounter revealed his inability to accept that other versions of himself might possess different values or make different choices without being inferior or defective in some fundamental way. The Ricks who rejected portal technology for practical reasons could be dismissed as timid or short-sighted, while those who cited ethical concerns could be characterized as naive or intellectually dishonest. But those who simply preferred their existing lives and relationships created cognitive dissonance that threatened his entire philosophical framework. The psychological pattern that emerged from Rick Prime's recruitment campaign revealed his transformation from someone who had initially pursued portal technology for personal reasons into someone whose sense of identity and purpose had become completely dependent on external validation from other versions of himself who would confirm the value and significance of his achievements through their willingness to abandon their own lives and relationships in favor of the multiversal existence he had pioneered. The rejection he experienced from some alternate Ricks was not just disappointing but existentially threatening. The community of converted Ricks that gradually formed around Rick Prime's recruitment efforts provided him with the intellectual companionship and collaborative opportunities that he had been seeking since his original abandonment of family life, but it also created new forms of responsibility and leadership challenges that he was not psychologically equipped to handle successfully. The other Ricks who joined his multiversal network had their own goals and interests that did not always align with his priorities, creating conflicts and disagreements that required diplomatic skills and emotional intelligence that his years of isolation and narcissistic development had not prepared him to exercise effectively. The technological projects that Rick Prime pursued in collaboration with his recruited alternate selves were more ambitious and sophisticated than anything he could have achieved working alone, but they were also increasingly divorced from any practical purpose or humanitarian benefit that might justify the resources and risks involved in their development. The scientific achievements that emerged from multiversal collaboration were impressive demonstrations of collective intelligence and capability, but they served primarily to reinforce the participants' sense of superiority over beings who remained confined to single realities, rather than addressing problems or needs that existed within those realities. Rick Prime's role as leader and pioneer within the growing community of interdimensional Ricks was simultaneously fulfilling and frustrating, as it provided him with the recognition and status he had always craved, while also requiring him to maintain relationships and coordinate activities in ways that conflicted with his preference for absolute autonomy and his inability to tolerate criticism or challenges to his authority. The other Ricks who had joined his multiversal network were not subordinates or followers, but intellectual equals who expected to be treated as partners in collaborative enterprises rather than students receiving instruction from a Pleason, superior teacher. The philosophical discussions that took place among Rick Prime's recruited alternate selves during this period revealed the gradual development of ideological frameworks and value systems that would eventually characterize multiversal Rick culture, but they also highlighted fundamental disagreements about the purpose and direction of their collective activities that could not be resolved through scientific analysis or technological innovation. The question of what interdimensional travelers should do with their capabilities once they had transcended the limitations of single reality existence proved more difficult to answer than the technical challenges involved in developing portal technology. Rick Prime's growing frustration with the democratic decision-making processes and collaborative approaches favored by other members of his multiversal community reflected his inability to accept that transcending dimensional limitations did not automatically resolve questions about meaning, purpose, and moral responsibility that had troubled him throughout his intellectual development. The power to travel between realities had not provided him with clear guidance about how to use that power in ways that would create lasting satisfaction or genuine fulfillment, and the other Ricks who shared his capabilities were struggling with similar questions about identity and purpose. The seeds of Rick Prime's eventual transformation from multiversal pioneer into cosmic-scale destroyer were planted during this period of community building and collaborative exploration, as his inability to find meaning through shared activities and mutual recognition gradually convinced him that the problem was not his own psychological limitations, but rather the inadequacy of other beings, including alternate versions of himself, to appreciate and reciprocate the kind of transcendent existence that his achievements had made possible. The stage was set for Rick Prime's evolution from frustrated community leader into solitary predator who would use his technological capabilities not to create or explore, but to destroy and dominate, transforming the multiversal network he had worked to establish into a hunting ground where he could exercise the kind of absolute power and control that collaborative relationships had denied him while pursuing forms of meaning and purpose that required victims rather than partners for their realization and expression. The dimensional coordinates that would lead Rick Prime to his most fateful encounter were not chosen through careful strategic planning or systematic survey of realities that might contain suitable targets for recruitment, but rather represented one more routine stop in what had become an increasingly mechanical process of interdimensional evangelism that no longer provided him with the psychological satisfaction and intellectual stimulation he had originally sought through his campaign to convert alternate versions of himself to the gospel of multiversal transcendence. The portal that opened in dimension cone 37 revealed a reality that appeared superficially identical to countless others Rick Prime had already visited, but the Rick who inhabited this particular version of his original life would prove to possess characteristics and make choices that would transform Rick Prime's disappointment with multiversal community building into the kind of personal rage and existential fury that could only be satisfied through systematic destruction of everything the refusing Rick valued and protected. The garage workshop where Rick Cone 37 pursued his scientific investigations was immediately recognizable to Rick Prime as a variant of the laboratory space where he had once conducted his own research before abandoning family obligations in favor of interdimensional exploration. But the differences in organization and equipment revealed philosophical approaches to scientific work that highlighted the divergent paths their lives had taken since the period when their experiences and choices had been essentially identical, where Rick Prime's original workspace had been characterized by increasingly obsessive focus and isolation from human contact. Rick Cone 37's laboratory retained clear evidence of integration with family life and domestic responsibilities that suggested fundamentally different priorities and values. Rick Prime's initial assessment of his alternate self was complicated by recognition that this particular Rick possessed the same intellectual capabilities and scientific knowledge that had enabled his own breakthrough achievements in portal technology, but had chosen to apply those abilities within frameworks that prioritized family relationships and community obligations over individual transcendence and unlimited exploration of multiversal possibilities. The theoretical work that covered Rick Cone 37's workspace revealed sophisticated understanding of dimensional physics that could have supported development of interdimensional travel technology, but the research remained focused on problems and applications that served the welfare of people within a single reality rather than pursuing the kind of cosmic-scale projects that had consumed Rick Prime's attention since his recruitment campaign began. The first words that Rick Prime spoke to his alternate self were carefully chosen to maximize their psychological impact while establishing his superior position as someone who had already achieved the kind of breakthrough that Rick Cone 37 was still struggling to develop through conventional methods. The casual demonstration of portal technology was designed not just to prove the reality of interdimensional travel, but also to create immediate sense of intellectual inadequacy and missed opportunity that would make Rick Cone 37 more receptive to arguments about the limitations and wasted potential inherent in his current lifestyle and scientific approach. Rick Prime's presentation of portal technology to Rick Cone 37 followed the same basic script he had developed through interactions with dozens of alternate selves, but it was delivered with particular intensity and psychological sophistication because this encounter represented one of his last opportunities to achieve the kind of meaningful conversion and validation that his recruitment campaign had originally been designed to produce. The theoretical framework he outlined was not just scientifically accurate, but also philosophically seductive, presenting interdimensional travel as liberation from arbitrary constraints that only inferior minds would choose to maintain when unlimited alternatives were readily available for exploration and exploitation. The offer that Rick Prime extended to Rick Cone 37 was framed in terms that appealed simultaneously to intellectual curiosity, personal ambition, and fear of being left behind by more adventurous alternate selves, who had already embraced their true potential through acceptance of portal technology and multiversal existence. The choice between accepting and rejecting his proposal was presented not as practical decision about competing priorities, but as fundamental test of Rick Cone 37's capacity for growth and transcendence that would determine whether he deserved to be classified among the superior beings who had evolved beyond normal human limitations and moral constraints. But the response that Rick Prime received from Rick Cone 37 was unlike anything he had encountered during his previous recruitment efforts, as this particular alternate self possessed not only sufficient intelligence to understand the full implications of portal technology, but also strong enough sense of personal identity and moral conviction to reject the offer without hesitation or apparent regret. The casual dismissal with which Rick Cone 37 declined to abandon his family and reality in favor of multiversal exploration was delivered with such confidence and finality that it revealed his complete indifference to Rick Prime's approval or disapproval of his choice. Rick Cone 37's explanation of his refusal to accept portal technology was not based on practical concerns about potential risks or ethical objections to interdimensional travel, but rather reflected philosophical commitment to values and priorities that Rick Prime had abandoned years earlier during his own evolution toward cosmic-scale detachment from normal human concerns. The alternate Rick's acknowledgement that he understood the significance of what was being offered, combined with his clear preference for the life he had already built with Diane and Beth, represented direct challenge to every assumption and rationalization that had supported Rick Prime's choices since his original abandonment of family obligations. The psychological impact of Rick Cone 37's rejection was devastating for Rick Prime in ways that transcended ordinary disappointment or frustration with unsuccessful recruitment attempts, because this particular alternate self represented the path not taken that he had spent years convincing himself was inferior and unsustainable for beings of their intellectual caliber. The existence of a Rick who possessed identical capabilities but had chosen to remain committed to family relationships and single reality existence undermined every justification Rick Prime had developed for his own lifestyle, while also highlighting the emotional and moral costs of his transformation into multiversal predator disguised as pioneer and teacher. Rick Prime's initial response to the rejection was carefully controlled and superficially respectful, as he attempted to maintain his facade as disinterested scientific collaborator while processing the psychological implications of encountering an alternate self who embodied everything he had rejected and abandoned. The brief conversation that followed Rick Cone 37's refusal revealed the extent to which Rick Prime's apparent generosity in sharing portal technology masked desperate need for validation that could only be satisfied through successful conversion of other versions of himself to worldviews and lifestyle choices that his damaged psyche required for stable functioning. But beneath Rick Prime's controlled exterior, the encounter with Rick Cone 37 was creating forms of rage and existential fury that exceeded anything he had experienced since his original discovery that he was the last Rick to develop teleportation technology. The casual confidence with which his alternate self had dismissed the opportunity for transcendence and unlimited exploration represented not just personal rejection, but philosophical challenge to the entire framework of meaning and purpose that Rick Prime had constructed around his achievements in portal technology and multiversal community building. The decision to leave Rick Cone 37's dimension without attempting further persuasion or negotiation was made with apparent grace and acceptance that masked Rick Prime's growing conviction that this particular alternate self deserved punishment for his failure to appreciate and embrace the opportunities that superior intelligence and advanced technology had made available. The polite farewell that Rick Prime offered before departing through his portal was delivered with the kind of cold courtesy that often precedes acts of calculated revenge designed to cause maximum psychological damage, while also demonstrating the consequences of rejecting offers that should have been gratefully accepted. Rick Prime's choice of weapon for his revenge against Rick Cone 37 revealed both his sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare and his complete transformation into someone whose approach to problem-solving had become indistinguishable from terrorism designed to cause suffering rather than achieve practical objectives. The bomb that he constructed was not simply an explosive device intended to kill his targets quickly and efficiently, but rather a sophisticated instrument of torture, designed to provide its victims with enough time to understand what was happening and experience full psychological impact of their imminent destruction, while being unable to prevent or escape their fate. The portal through which Rick Prime delivered his explosive gift to Rick Cone 37's garage was opened with the same casual precision that characterized all of his technical achievements, but the act of using interdimensional travel technology for murder revealed how completely his scientific capabilities had been corrupted by psychological needs that could only be satisfied through causing suffering to people who represented everything he had rejected and abandoned. The bomb was not just intended to kill Diane and Beth Cone 37, but also to destroy Rick's sense of identity and purpose in ways that would force him to confront the same existential emptiness that Rick Prime experienced whenever his recruitment efforts failed to provide adequate validation. The timing of Rick Prime's attack was calculated to maximize its psychological impact by striking at the moment when Rick Cone 37 would be most likely to witness the destruction of his family while being unable to prevent or mitigate their suffering. The explosion was designed not just to cause death, but to create the kind of traumatic experience that would permanently damage Rick's capacity for normal emotional functioning, while also demonstrating the consequences of choosing family obligations over multiversal transcendence and unlimited exploration of dimensional possibilities. Rick Prime's psychological state during the execution of his revenge plot was characterized by cold satisfaction rather than emotional turmoil, as he had successfully transformed his rage at being rejected into an opportunity to conduct an experiment in applied psychology that would test his theories about the relationship between trauma and transcendence, while also providing him with concrete demonstration of his superior power and capability. The murder of Diane and Beth Cone 37 was not just personal revenge, but also philosophical statement about the ultimate futility of choosing love and commitment over individual achievement and cosmic-scale ambition. The aftermath of Rick Prime's bombing attack provided him with the kind of validation and sense of superiority that his recruitment campaign had failed to deliver through consensual conversion of alternate selves to his worldview and lifestyle choices. The knowledge that he had successfully destroyed Rick Cone 37's capacity for domestic happiness, while also eliminating the people whose welfare had motivated his refusal to accept portal technology, created psychological satisfaction that temporarily resolved the existential anxiety and identity crisis that had been building throughout his increasingly unsuccessful attempts to find meaning through multiversal community building and collaborative exploration. But perhaps most importantly, Rick Prime's murder of Diane and Beth Cohn 37 marked his definitive transformation from someone who used violence as means to achieve specific objectives into someone whose primary source of meaning and purpose had become the systematic destruction of happiness and security that other beings had managed to achieve within the constraints of single reality existence. The casual ease with which he had eliminated two innocent people in order to punish their husband and father revealed psychological evolution toward forms of evil that transcended normal categories of criminal behavior or mental illness. The message that Rick Prime intended to send through his bombing attack was not limited to Rick Cohn 37, but was also designed to serve as warning to any other alternate selves who might consider rejecting his future offers of portal technology and multiversal transcendence. The demonstration of his willingness and ability to destroy the lives and relationships that provided other Ricks with meaning and motivation was calculated to make resistance seem not just futile, but actively dangerous to everyone that, refusing Ricks, might care about protecting from similar attacks. The psychological satisfaction that Rick Prime derived from his successful revenge against Rick Cohn 37 was enhanced by his recognition that the attack had not just eliminated two people, but had also created conditions that would likely transform his alternate self into someone more similar to himself, isolated, traumatized, and motivated primarily by hatred rather than love. The possibility that Rick Cohn 37 might eventually develop his own portal technology in pursuit of revenge created opportunities for future encounters that could provide Rick Prime with additional sources of entertainment and validation through psychological warfare conducted on increasingly sophisticated levels. The seeds of Rick Prime's evolution into the multiverse's most dangerous predator were fully planted during his encounter with Rick Cohn 37 and the revenge attack that followed, as he discovered that causing suffering to people who possessed things he had abandoned or been unable to achieve provided more psychological satisfaction than any collaborative project or community building effort he had previously attempted. The transformation was complete. Rick Prime had become someone whose primary relationship with other beings was as sources of entertainment through their destruction rather than potential partners in exploration or creation. The stage was set for years of increasingly systematic violence that would eventually encompass not just individual acts of revenge, but genocide conducted on multiversal scales. As Rick Prime's need for validation and superiority evolved beyond recruitment of willing converts toward elimination of anyone whose existence served as reminder of possibilities he had rejected or been unable to sustain throughout his long descent from family man to cosmic horror, the escalation from individual acts of revenge against specific Ricks who had rejected Rick Prime's recruitment offers to systematic genocide against entire categories of beings across infinite realities represented perhaps the most psychologically revealing transformation in his evolution, from locally destructive family abandoner to cosmic-scale threat that exceeded the destructive potential of natural disasters, military conflicts, or any other form of violence that confined itself to single dimensions and finite populations. The decision to develop technology capable of erasing every version of Diane from the entire multiverse was not made through rational assessment of strategic objectives or practical benefits, but rather emerged from psychological needs and emotional compulsions that had been building throughout his years of failed community building. and increasingly unsatisfactory attempts to find meaning through conversion of alternate selves to his worldview and lifestyle choices. The theoretical breakthrough that enabled Rick Prime to conceive of multiversal genocide began with his recognition that the rejection he had experienced from Rick Cone 37 and other alternate selves was not simply personal disappointment or professional setback, but rather represented existential threat to the entire framework of meaning and identity that he had constructed around his achievements in portal technology and his role as pioneer of interdimensional civilization. The existence of Ricks who possessed identical intellectual capabilities but had chosen to prioritize family relationships and single reality obligations over multiversal transcendence served as constant reminder of possibilities he had rejected and forms of happiness he had been unable to sustain throughout his psychological development. The mathematical frameworks that Rick Prime developed to support his Omega device project were not just sophisticated applications of dimensional physics and energy manipulation theory, but also expressions of his growing conviction that the multiverse itself was flawed and required correction through elimination of elements that supported forms of meaning and purpose incompatible with the kind of unlimited individual transcendence that his superior intelligence both enabled and demanded. The equations that governed multiversal existence could be rewritten to exclude categories of experience that he found psychologically threatening or philosophically unacceptable. Rick Prime's workshop during the Omega device development period was transformed from interdimensional laboratory where he pursued collaborative projects with recruited alternate selves into something approaching a fortress of obsessive calculation where he could develop technologies of unprecedented destructive capability while avoiding all forms of human contact that might interfere with his increasingly megalomaniacal planning processes. The equipment he assembled there represented the most advanced applications of portal technology and dimensional manipulation ever attempted by any Rick in any reality, but it was also organized according to principles that prioritized maximum destructive potential over safety, ethics, or consideration for anyone who might be affected by his experimental procedures. The prototype versions of the Omega device that Rick Prime constructed during the early stages of his genocide project were tested on individual Dians from carefully selected dimensions where their elimination would provide him with data about the weapon's effectiveness, while also serving his psychological need to destroy representations of the love and commitment that he had been unable to maintain in his own life. The casual way he selected test subjects revealed his complete transformation into someone who viewed other conscious beings as expendable resources in pursuit of abstract theoretical objectives, rather than individuals deserving of basic moral consideration. The technical challenges involved in developing technology capable of eliminating specific individuals across all possible realities simultaneously were staggering in their complexity and required Rick Prime to push the boundaries of dimensional physics and energy manipulation far beyond anything that had been previously attempted by any Rick in any dimension. The mathematical models necessary to identify and target every possible version of a single person across infinite variations of existence demanded computational capabilities and theoretical sophistication that exceeded normal human intellectual limitations, but they also represented applications of scientific knowledge that served no purpose beyond satisfying his pathological need to eliminate anyone whose continued existence might serve as reminder of his own failures and limitations. The philosophical framework that Rick Prime developed to justify his multiversal genocide project was not simply rationalization designed to make himself feel better about systematic murder, but rather reflected genuine belief that the multiverse would be improved through elimination of individuals whose existence supported forms of meaning and purpose that conflicted with his conviction that superior intelligence justified unlimited moral flexibility and complete transcendence of normal ethical constraints. The existence of loving relationships and successful family bonds across infinite realities represented systematic error in cosmic design that required correction through targeted application of advanced technology. Rick Prime's psychological state during the months he spent perfecting the Omega device was characterized by increasing detachment from normal emotional responses and growing satisfaction with his role as cosmic editor, whose superior understanding of reality's true nature enabled him to make corrections and improvements that less intelligent beings could not appreciate or understand. The project provided him with sense of purpose and importance that his previous attempts at community building and recruitment had failed to deliver, while also confirming his identity as someone whose capabilities placed him beyond normal moral categories and social obligations. The final version of the Omega device that Rick Prime completed after months of obsessive refinement was not just the most sophisticated weapon ever created by any Rick in any dimension, but also represented the ultimate expression of his psychological evolution toward forms of evil that transcended normal human capacity for cruelty and destruction. The device was capable of identifying and eliminating every possible version of any specified individual across infinite realities simultaneously, erasing them not just from physical existence, but from the fundamental structure of space-time itself, in ways that made their previous existence undetectable through any form of investigation or analysis. The decision about which version of Diane to use as the targeting template for his multiversal genocide was made with careful consideration of the psychological impact that different choices might have on the surviving Ricks who would discover the elimination of their wives. But ultimately, Rick Prime selected his own original Diane as the primary target, because her destruction would symbolically complete his rejection of everything she had represented about love, commitment, and the constraints that caring about others imposed on individual freedom and cosmic-scale ambition. The activation of the Omega device was conducted with ritualistic precision that transformed the act of multiversal murder into something approaching religious ceremony. As Rick Prime used the moment of ultimate destructive achievement to formally declare his transcendence beyond normal human moral categories, while also establishing his identity as cosmic force, whose actions shaped the fundamental structure of reality, according to principles that only he possessed, sufficient intelligence and philosophical sophistication to understand and implement. The immediate effects of the Omega device were impossible to observe directly, because the elimination of every Diane from the multiverse was accomplished instantaneously across all possible realities. But Rick Prime's monitoring equipment confirmed the success of his genocide project through detection of dimensional perturbations and energy signatures that indicated systematic removal of targeted individuals from the fabric of space-time itself. The technical success of the weapon exceeded even his optimistic projections, demonstrating capabilities that established him as the most dangerous being ever to exist within any accessible region of the multiverse. The psychological impact of successfully eliminating every version of his wife from infinite realities was simultaneously exhilarating and deeply unsettling for Rick Prime, as the achievement represented both ultimate validation of his superior capabilities and final severing of his connection to the emotional experiences and moral frameworks that had once provided his existence with meaning and direction. The satisfaction he derived from his successful genocide was accompanied by recognition that he had transformed himself into something that could no longer be classified as recognizably human in terms of psychology, motivation, or relationship to other conscious beings. But perhaps most importantly, the success of Rick Prime's multiversal genocide created practical problems and strategic challenges that his psychological obsession with eliminating Diane had prevented him from anticipating or planning for adequately. The systematic removal of beloved family members from countless Rick's lives would inevitably create massive numbers of traumatized and revenge-seeking alternate selves whose combined resources and determination would pose unprecedented threats to his security and continued existence, requiring defensive preparations and strategic planning that would consume increasing amounts of his time and attention. The immediate aftermath of the Omega device activation was characterized by dimensional instabilities and communication disruptions that made it difficult for Rick Prime to assess the full scope of his genocide's impact on multiversal civilization. But the energy signatures and portal traffic patterns that he was able to monitor suggested that his successful elimination of every Diane had created exactly the kind of chaos and traumatic disruption that he had intended to produce. The psychological warfare implications of his achievement were as significant as its technical accomplishment, demonstrating his ability to strike at any target, regardless of location, protection, or dimensional barriers. The defensive measures that Rick Prime began implementing in response to the anticipated retaliation from surviving Ricks were not just practical preparations for physical attacks, but also psychological warfare strategies designed to maximize the suffering and frustration of anyone who might attempt to track him down or interfere with his future projects. The decoy system he developed was intended not just to confuse and mislead his enemies, but also to provide him with opportunities for additional entertainment through the systematic torture and elimination of Ricks who possessed sufficient courage or desperation to hunt for him across infinite realities. The network of false identities and duplicate hideouts that Rick Prime established across multiple dimensions represented the most sophisticated defensive system ever created by any individual Rick. But it also reflected his evolution from someone who had once sought community and collaboration with alternate selves into someone who viewed all other conscious beings as potential threats that required either elimination or neutralization through systematic application of superior intelligence and technological capability. The defensive preparations were not just responses to external threats, but also expressions of his philosophical commitment to absolute individualism and cosmic-scale autonomy. Rick Prime's psychological satisfaction with his successful multiversal genocide was enhanced by his recognition that the project had established him as a unique figure in the history of dimensional civilization, the first being ever to successfully eliminate an entire category of existence from the multiverse, while also demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything previously achieved by individual action rather than collective effort. The Omega device had transformed him from exceptional Rick into cosmic force, whose actions reshaped the fundamental structure of reality according to his personal preferences and psychological needs. The long-term implications of Rick Prime's genocide project extended far beyond the immediate elimination of every Diane to encompass systematic disruption of family relationships and emotional bonds across infinite realities, creating forms of trauma and psychological damage that would affect countless populations, while also establishing precedent for the kind of cosmic-scale violence that advanced technology made possible when applied by individuals whose moral development had not kept pace with their intellectual and technical achievements. The The stage was set for years of escalating conflict between Rick Prime and the growing numbers of traumatized Ricks whose lives had been destroyed by his multiversal genocide. But more importantly, the successful completion of his Omega device project had confirmed his identity as being whose relationship to other forms of conscious existence was fundamentally predatory and whose continued activities would pose existential threats to the stability and welfare of anyone unlucky enough to inhabit realities that fell within the scope of his attention and interest. The dimensional coordinates that had once represented home for Rick Prime held a significance that transcended simple geographical or sentimental attachment, as the reality where he had first abandoned his family and begun his transformation into multiversal predator contained not just the physical locations where his most formative psychological experiences had occurred, but also the ongoing evidence of choices and possibilities that his evolution toward cosmic-scale monstrosity had systematically eliminated from his own existence. The portal reset that scattered interdimensional travelers back to their original dimensions during the SolarX incident created an opportunity for Rick Prime to observe the long-term consequences of his abandonment while also providing him with direct access to the family he had rejected and the alternate version of himself who had chosen to replace him in their lives. The house that Rick Prime approached after decades of multiversal exile was superficially identical to the home he remembered from his years as husband and father, but the subtle changes in maintenance and decoration revealed the passage of time and the influence of different priorities and aesthetic preferences that had shaped the domestic environment during his absence. The garden that Diane had once tended with Beth's enthusiastic assistance had been replaced by different landscaping that reflected Jerry's practical approach to yard work, while the garage that had once served as Rick Prime's workshop had been transformed into Rick Cone 37's interdimensional laboratory, where portal technology served family adventures rather than cosmic scale. Predation, Rick Prime's initial surveillance of his replacement family, was conducted with the same systematic thoroughness and analytical detachment that characterized all of his research projects, but the psychological impact of observing alternate versions of his abandoned wife and daughter, living apparently successful and happy lives with the Rick who had rejected his original recruitment offer, created emotional responses that he had not anticipated or prepared for adequately. The evidence that domestic happiness and family relationships could be sustained over decades, despite the intellectual and creative constraints they imposed, forced him to confront questions about his own choices that his philosophical frameworks were not equipped to address satisfactorily. The family dynamics that Rick Prime observed through his covert monitoring revealed patterns of interaction and emotional connection that were both familiar and disturbing, as they demonstrated that the relationships he had found insufferable during his original family life could be maintained successfully by alternate versions of the same people when they were supported by different attitudes and priorities. About the relative importance of individual achievement versus collective welfare. The casual affection and mutual support that characterized the Smith family's daily routines served as constant reminder of possibilities he had abandoned and forms of meaning he had been unable to sustain throughout his psychological development. The technological sophistication of Rick Cone 37's workshop equipment was immediately apparent to Rick Prime's expert analysis, confirming that his replacement possessed identical intellectual capabilities and had achieved similar breakthroughs in portal technology and dimensional physics. But the integration of scientific work with family responsibilities and the obvious evidence of collaborative projects with Morty revealed philosophical approaches to genius and creativity that highlighted the different paths their lives had taken since their first encounter decades earlier. Where Rick Prime's laboratories had been fortresses of isolation designed to exclude all human contact, Rick Cone 37's workspace remained connected to domestic life and family concerns. The relationship between Rick Cone 37 and Morty was particularly fascinating to Rick Prime because it represented a form of intergenerational connection and mutual influence that he had never experienced during his own brief period as father to Beth, but it also demonstrated the kind of emotional investment and protective commitment that Rick Prime had systematically eliminated from his own psychological makeup during his evolution toward cosmic-scale predation and absolute individual autonomy. The obvious affection and respect that characterized their interactions revealed possibilities for meaningful relationships that transcended simple utility or entertainment value. Rick Prime's psychological response to witnessing Rick Cone 37's successful integration of scientific achievement with family relationships was complicated by recognition that this alternate version of himself had not only maintained the emotional connections and moral frameworks that Rick Prime had abandoned, but had also achieved forms of satisfaction and purpose that Rick Prime's own quest for unlimited freedom and cosmic-scale significance had failed to provide. Despite his superior technological capabilities and multiversal influence, the happiness that his replacement family displayed was not based on ignorance or limitation, but rather on choices that Rick Prime had been unable to make successfully. The decision to remain hidden rather than reveal his presence immediately was motivated not by strategic considerations about optimal timing for confrontation or revenge, but rather by Rick Prime's growing fascination with observing relationships and lifestyle patterns that represented everything he had rejected, while also demonstrating that his assumptions about the incompatibility of genius with domestic obligations might have been incorrect, or at least not universally applicable to all versions of his basic personality and intellectual capabilities. The months that Rick Prime spent in covert observation of his replacement family provided him with unprecedented insights into the long-term consequences of different approaches to balancing individual achievement with interpersonal relationships, but they also created forms of psychological stress and existential questioning that he was not equipped to process through his normal frameworks of analysis and rationalization. The evidence that alternate versions of his abandoned family had not only survived his departure, but had thrived under Rick Cone 37's protection, forced him to confront the possibility that his original abandonment had been unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. The adventures that Rick Prime witnessed between Rick Cone 37 and Morty revealed applications of portal technology and interdimensional travel that served educational and bonding purposes rather than predation or systematic exploitation of other realities, demonstrating philosophical approaches to unlimited power that prioritize protection and growth over domination and destruction. The obvious enjoyment and mutual satisfaction that grandfather and grandson derived from their collaborative exploration of alternate dimensions highlighted forms of meaning and purpose that Rick Prime had never considered or pursued during his own multiversal activities. But perhaps most disturbing to Rick Prime's sense of identity and self-justification was his recognition that Rick Cone 37 had not only maintained successful family relationships, but had also achieved scientific AT and technological accomplishments that equaled or exceeded Rick Prime's own achievements while operating within moral and ethical constraints that Rick Prime had abandoned as incompatible with unlimited individual freedom and cosmic-scale ambition. The existence of a Rick who possessed identical capabilities but had chosen different priorities undermined every rationalization that Rick Prime had developed for his own lifestyle and behavioral choices. The psychological tension that built within Rick Prime during his extended observation period was not just frustration with his replacement or envy of the happiness that his abandoned family had achieved with someone else, but rather fundamental crisis of identity and purpose that threatened the entire framework of meaning and self-understanding that he had constructed around his transformation from family man to multiversal predator. The casual contentment and obvious love that characterized the Smith family's daily interactions served as constant reminder of everything he had lost and been unable to recover through technological achievement or cosmic scale influence. Rick Prime's growing awareness that he could eliminate Rick Cone 37 at any time and reclaim his position within the family structure was complicated by his simultaneous recognition that doing so would not restore the emotional connections and psychological capabilities that had made his original family relationships meaningful before his evolution toward antisocial predation and systematic elimination of normal human moral constraints. The people he observed were not just older versions of the family he had abandoned, but had been shaped by decades of experiences and influences that he had not shared and could not replicate through simple replacement or impersonation. The irony of Rick Prime's situation was not lost on him during his quiet moments of reflection about the path that had led him from domestic abandonment to cosmic-scale genocide to covert observation of the life he might have lived if he had made different choices about priorities and values during the crucial periods when his psychological development was still malleable enough to support different outcomes. The technological capabilities that had enabled his transformation into the multiverse's most dangerous predator had also provided him with access to direct evidence of the life he had rejected and the forms of happiness he had been unable to sustain. The decision to remain hidden indefinitely rather than attempting to reclaim his position within the family was based not on strategic calculations about optimal approaches to confrontation or manipulation, but rather on Rick Prime's growing understanding that the psychological changes he had undergone during his years of multiversal predation had made him fundamentally incompatible with the kind of relationships and emotional investments that successful family life required. The capacity for love and protective commitment that Rick Cone 37 demonstrated was not just different from Rick Prime's current capabilities, but was actively incompatible with the philosophical frameworks and behavioral patterns that defined his identity. The entertainment value that Rick Prime derived from observing his replacement family's adventures and domestic routines was enhanced by his recognition that he possessed superior knowledge and capabilities that could be used to influence or manipulate their experiences if he chose to intervene. But the restraint he showed in avoiding such interventions revealed his growing appreciation for the integrity and authenticity of relationships that had developed without his participation or control. The happiness he witnessed was genuine rather than manufactured, making it both more valuable and more painful to observe as external spectator. The long-term sustainability of Rick Prime's covert observation was threatened not by external discovery or security concerns, but by the psychological impact of witnessing forms of meaning and connection that highlighted the emptiness and purposelessness that characterized his own existence despite his superior technological capabilities and multiversal influence. The contrast between his replacement family's obvious contentment and his own persistent dissatisfaction created internal tensions that could not be resolved through additional technological achievements or expanded predatory activities. The stage was set for Rick Prime's eventual confrontation with the family he had abandoned and the Rick who had replaced him, but more importantly, his extended observation period had provided him with direct evidence that his assumptions about the relationship between genius and happiness might have been incorrect, creating possibilities for different choices and behavioral patterns that his evolved psychology was no longer capable of implementing successfully, despite his intellectual understanding of their potential benefits. The emergence of Jerry Prime as an unlikely threat to Rick Prime's continued existence represented one of the most unexpected and psychologically revealing encounters in the entire saga of multiversal conflict between Rick Prime and Morty, the family he had abandoned decades earlier. As the man who had married his daughter and assumed responsibility for raising his grandchildren possessed none of the intellectual capabilities or technological resources that might have made him a credible opponent in conventional terms, but demonstrated forms of moral courage and protective instinct that Rick Prime had systematically eliminated from his own psychological makeup during his evolution toward cosmic-scale predation and absolute individual autonomy. Jerry Prime's recognition of the threat that Rick Prime posed to his family's safety and happiness was not based on sophisticated analysis of dimensional physics or advanced understanding of portal technology, but rather emerged from the kind of intuitive understanding of human motivation and behavioral patterns that ordinary people develop through years of careful observation and emotional investment in the welfare of others. The man who had spent decades learning to navigate the complex dynamics of living with a genius scientist while maintaining his own sense of dignity and purpose was uniquely qualified to recognize when someone with Rick's face was not actually the Rick who had chosen to protect and nurture the relationships that Jerry valued most. The psychological framework that enabled Jerry Prime to overcome his natural fear and intimidation in the face of Rick Prime's obvious technological superiority and casual capacity for violence was built on foundations of love and protective commitment that Rick Prime had long ago abandoned as incompatible with the kind of unlimited individual freedom that his intellectual capabilities both enabled and demanded. The courage that Jerry displayed in confronting a being whose power exceeded anything that normal human resistance could hope to challenge was not based on confidence in his ability to succeed, but rather on recognition that some threats were too dangerous to ignore, even when opposition seemed futile. Jerry Prime's approach to the confrontation with Rick Prime revealed sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare and strategic thinking that belied his reputation for intellectual mediocrity and emotional instability, as he correctly identified Rick Prime's primary vulnerability as his narcissistic need for validation and recognition from other versions of himself. The offer of alliance and collaboration was not sincere expression of shared values, but rather calculated attempt to create opportunities for close contact that might enable physical attack despite Rick Prime's superior defensive capabilities and technological resources. The conversation between Jerry Prime and Rick Prime during their brief alliance negotiation provided both participants with insights into each other's motivations and capabilities that revealed the fundamental differences in their conversation, approaches to relationships and responsibility, while also highlighting the extent to which Rick Prime's evolution toward cosmic-scale predation had eliminated his capacity for the kind of genuine human connection that Jerry represented despite his obvious limitations and personal flaws. Jerry's willingness to work with someone he recognized as dangerous in order to protect his family demonstrated forms of moral flexibility and strategic thinking that Rick Prime had not anticipated from someone he had dismissed as intellectually inferior. The tactical elements of Jerry Prime's attack plan were necessarily simple and direct, as he lacked access to advanced technology or sophisticated weapons that might have provided him with genuine advantages over someone whose capabilities included interdimensional travel and energy manipulation on cosmic scales. The physical assault that Jerry attempted was based on recognition that Rick Prime's technological superiority would be meaningless if he could be eliminated through conventional violence before he had opportunity to deploy his advanced defensive systems or escape through portal technology to more secure locations. Rick Prime's initial response to Jerry's attack was complicated by surprise and grudging respect for the audacity and courage required to challenge someone whose reputation for casual violence and unlimited technological capability should have made physical confrontation seem impossible for any ordinary human being. The momentary success that Jerry achieved in his assault created psychological impact that exceeded the minor physical damage he was able to inflict, as it demonstrated that Rick Prime's sense of invulnerability and superior capability could be challenged by beings who possessed sufficient motivation and willingness to accept extreme personal risk. The healing technology that Rick Prime used to recover from Jerry's attack was not just demonstration of his superior scientific capabilities, but also symbolic representation of the fundamental differences between beings who could transcend normal human limitations through advanced technology and those who remained constrained by biological vulnerabilities and finite lifespans. The casual ease with which Rick Prime repaired the damage that had required enormous courage and determination for Jerry to inflict highlighted the ultimate futility of conventional resistance against someone whose evolution had placed him beyond normal categories of vulnerability and accountability. But Rick Prime's psychological response to Jerry's attack revealed the extent to which his years of multiversal predation and systematic elimination of potential threats had not completely eliminated his capacity for emotional reactions to unexpected challenges and demonstrations of principles that he had abandoned, but still retained enough memory to recognize and evaluate. The anger that motivated his brutal retaliation against Jerry was not just irritation at physical inconvenience, but also rage at being reminded of forms of meaning and purpose that his own choices had made inaccessible to him. The method that Rick Prime chose for Jerry's execution was designed not just to eliminate a threat, but to demonstrate his superior power, while also expressing his contempt for the values and relationships that had motivated Jerry's heroic but futile assault. The prolonged and painful nature of Jerry's death served multiple purposes beyond simple revenge, as it also provided Rick Prime with opportunity to conduct informal experiment in applied psychology while studying the effects of systematic torture on someone whose moral framework remained intact despite extreme physical and emotional stress. Jerry Prime's behavior during his torture and execution revealed characteristics that Rick Prime found both fascinating and disturbing. As the man who was dying for his family's protection maintained dignity and moral consistency that contrasted sharply with Rick Prime's own evolution toward casual cruelty and systematic abandonment of ethical constraints. The courage and love that Jerry displayed, even while experiencing extreme suffering, served as a reminder of possibilities for meaning and purpose that Rick Prime had rejected but had never completely forgotten or eliminated from his being. Psychological awareness. The final words that Jerry Prime spoke before his death were not pleas for mercy or expressions of regret about his failed attack, but rather affirmations of love for his family and commitment to values that transcended individual survival and personal advantage. The integrity that Jerry maintained throughout his torture provided Rick Prime with direct evidence of forms of moral strength and emotional authenticity that his own superior intelligence and technological capabilities had not enabled him to achieve or sustain throughout his long evolution toward cosmic scale monstrosity. Rick Prime's psychological response to Jerry's death was complicated by recognition that he had eliminated someone whose courage and moral conviction had briefly made him more admirable than Rick Prime himself, despite the vast differences in their intellectual capabilities and technological resources. The man who had possessed no advantages except love for his family and willingness to sacrifice everything for their protection had demonstrated qualities that Rick Prime's transformation into multiversal predator had systematically eliminated from his own character and behavioral patterns. The irony of Jerry Prime's heroic failure was not lost on Rick Prime during his subsequent reflections about the encounter and its implications for his understanding of strength, courage, and the relationship between intelligence and moral worth. In contexts where unlimited power made normal ethical considerations seem arbitrary and constraining, the recognition that someone he had dismissed as intellectually inferior had possessed forms of strength and authenticity that Rick Prime could no longer access or demonstrate, or created cognitive dissonance that threatened his carefully constructed philosophical frameworks about superiority and transcendence. The disposal of Jerry's body was conducted with the same casual efficiency that Rick Prime brought to all practical tasks that lacked psychological or intellectual interest. But the elimination of evidence could not eliminate the memory of an encounter that had forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between his technological achievements and his capacity for the kind of meaning and purpose that Jerry had died defending. The heroic failure had succeeded in ways that simple success could not have accomplished. The long-term psychological impact of Jerry Prime's attack and subsequent execution extended beyond immediate practical consequences to encompass fundamental questions about Rick Prime's identity and purpose that his normal strategies of intellectual superiority and technological innovation could not resolve satisfactorily. The recognition that ordinary people could possess qualities that his evolution toward cosmic-scale predation had eliminated created existential anxiety that would influence his subsequent choices and behavioral patterns in ways he did not fully understand or acknowledge. The stage was set for Rick Prime's continued confrontation with family members whose love and protective commitment represented everything he had abandoned during his transformation from husband and father into the multiverse's most dangerous predator. But Jerry's heroic sacrifice had also established precedent for forms of resistance that transcended normal calculations about power and capability, while demonstrating that moral courage could create meaningful opposition even when physical victory remained impossible. The discovery of Rick Prime's presence within his original dimension came not through systematic surveillance or advanced detection technology, but through the kind of casual observation and intuitive pattern recognition that Rick Cone 37 had developed during his years of interdimensional travel and exposure to the subtle environmental changes that accompanied portal activity and dimensional manipulation by beings whose technological capabilities exceeded normal limitations. The energy signatures and temporal distortions that Rick Prime's covert monitoring equipment produced were nearly undetectable by conventional instruments, but they created atmospheric disturbances and quantum fluctuations that someone with Rick's expertise could identify as evidence of sophisticated dimensional physics being applied within his local reality. Rick Cone 37's initial response to detecting evidence of interdimensional activity within his dimension was characterized by the same analytical caution and systematic investigation that had enabled his survival during years of multiversal conflict and exposure to threats that exceeded normal human capacity to understand or counter effectively. The possibility that another Rick might be operating within his reality created security concerns that transcended ordinary territorial disputes or professional competition. As interdimensional travelers with hostile intentions could pose existential threats to entire populations while remaining virtually invisible to conventional detection methods and defensive systems. The tracking technology that Rick Cohn, 37, developed to identify and locate the source of dimensional disturbances within his reality represented one of his most sophisticated applications of portal physics and quantum mechanics, requiring theoretical frameworks and computational capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what individual intelligence could achieve without access to the collective resources and collaborative knowledge that characterized large-scale scientific institutions. The detection array he constructed in his garage laboratory was designed not just to locate interdimensional activity, but also to analyze the technological signatures and operational patterns that might reveal the identity and intentions of whoever was conducting covert surveillance within his dimension. The gradual realization that Rick Prime had returned to his original dimension after decades of multiversal exile created psychological and practical challenges that Rick Cohn, 37, was not fully prepared to address. Despite his extensive experience with dangerous alternate versions of himself and his sophisticated understanding of the motivations and capabilities that drove multiversal conflict between different factions of Rick's civilization, the return of the Rick who had murdered his family and initiated his own transformation from domestic scientist into interdimensional predator represented the convergence of personal revenge opportunities with cosmic-scale threats that could endanger everyone he had come to love and protect. Rick Cohn, 37's decision to involve Morty in his investigation and tracking of Rick Prime was motivated not by casual disregard for his grandson's safety, but rather by recognition that the technological challenges involved in hunting someone with Rick Prime's capabilities and defensive resources would require collaborative effort and the kind of multiversal experience that Morty had accumulated during their years of interdimensional adventure and exposure to threats that exceeded normal human understanding. The boy's unique perspective and emotional insights had proven valuable in previous encounters with dangerous alternate selves, while his presence provided Rick with psychological grounding that prevented complete absorption in revenge obsessions. The equipment modifications that Rick Cohn, 37, made to his portal gun and dimensional scanning technology were designed specifically to counter the advanced defensive measures and technological countermeasures that Rick Prime had developed during his years of evading multiversal hunters and eliminating threats to his security and continued activities. The theoretical breakthrough that enabled Rick to track someone who possessed identical intellectual capabilities and superior resources came through recognition that Rick Prime's psychological patterns and behavioral preferences created predictable vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with intimate understanding of Rick's psychology and sufficient patience to conduct long-term surveillance and analysis operations. The collaboration between Rick Cohn, 37, and Morty during their hunt for Rick Prime revealed the extent to which their relationship had evolved from simple grandfather-grandson dynamics into genuine partnership based on ATA, mutual respect and complementary capabilities that transcended normal family structures and generational hierarchies. Morty's questions and observations forced Rick to articulate and examine his own motivations and methods in ways that improved both his strategic planning and his emotional awareness of the personal costs that successful revenge might impose on their family relationships and individual psychological development. The psychological preparation that Rick Cohn, 37, underwent as he developed increasingly sophisticated methods for tracking and confronting Rick Prime was complicated by his recognition that successful completion of his decades-long quest for revenge might not provide the satisfaction or closure he had anticipated. while failure could result in elimination not just of himself, but also of the family he had chosen to protect and nurture during his years of dimensional exile. The internal tension between his need for justice and his protective responsibilities created forms of stress and moral complexity that no amount of technological capability or strategic planning could resolve through conventional, problem-solving approaches. The technical breakthrough that finally enabled Rick Cone 37 to locate Rick Prime's actual position came through analysis of quantum resonance patterns and dimensional signature variations that revealed the sophisticated camouflage and misdirection systems that Rick Prime had developed to conceal his presence while maintaining covert surveillance capabilities. The detection required not just advanced technology, but also intuitive understanding of Rick Prime's psychological preferences and operational patterns that could only be developed through years of studying his methods and anticipating his strategic responses to different forms of pressure and investigation. Rick Prime's awareness that he had been discovered by Rick Cone 37 created the kind of anticipatory excitement and strategic challenge that he had not experienced since his early encounters with multiversal hunters, whose capabilities had posed genuine threats to his security and continued activities. The prospect of direct confrontation with the Rick, whose family he had murdered decades earlier, represented not just potential danger, but also opportunity to demonstrate his superior evolution and technological capabilities while testing theories about trauma, revenge, and the psychological development of beings who had been shaped by exposure to cosmic-scale violence and systematic loss of everything they valued. The preparation phase that preceded their final confrontation was characterized by escalating technological innovations and strategic maneuvers, as both Ricks developed increasingly sophisticated methods for gaining advantages over an opponent whose intellectual capabilities were identical to their own, but whose experiences and psychological development had followed different trajectories that created both predictable patterns and unexpected vulnerabilities. The arms race between hunter and hunted transcended normal categories of conflict to become a form of cosmic chess game, where individual moves carried implications that could affect entire dimensions and populations. The psychological warfare that Rick Prime conducted during this period was designed not just to gain tactical advantages, but also to test Rick Cone 37's emotional stability and commitment to family relationships that Rick Prime viewed as fundamental weaknesses that could be exploited through systematic application of pressure and manipulation. The threats he made were calculated to create maximum anxiety and moral conflict, while also demonstrating his superior understanding of the psychological vulnerabilities that characterized beings who retained enough humanity to be wounded by loss and motivated by protective love. Rick Cone 37's response to Rick Prime's psychological warfare revealed the extent to which his years of interdimensional adventure and exposure to cosmic-scale threats had not eliminated his capacity for normal human emotional responses, but had rather strengthened his commitment to values and relationships that provided meaning and purpose despite their apparent incompatibility with unlimited power and absolute individual freedom. The anger and determination that Rick Prime's taunts created were not signs of weakness, but rather evidence of successful psychological development that had integrated advanced capabilities with sustained moral frameworks. The involvement of other family members in Rick Cone 37's hunt for Rick Prime was minimized, not through secrecy or deception, but through careful management of information and strategic planning that protected them from direct exposure to dangers they were not equipped to understand or counter, while maintaining their emotional support and collaborative assistance with aspects of the hunt that did not require specialized knowledge or advanced technological capabilities. The balance between protection and inclusion required constant adjustment as circumstances evolved and threats escalated. The final phase of preparation before their confrontation was marked by Rick Cohn, 37's growing recognition that success in eliminating Rick Prime might require him to embrace methods and psychological frameworks that would transform him into something more similar to his target than he was comfortable acknowledging or accepting. The moral complexity of using violence and deception against someone whose crimes justified extreme measures created internal conflicts that could not be resolved through rational analysis or technological innovation. Morty's role during this crucial period extended beyond simple technical assistance to include emotional support and moral guidance that helped Rick Cohn, 37, maintain connection to values and relationships that provided alternatives to the kind of obsessive revenge seeking that had consumed other Ricks who had pursued similar objectives. The boy's questions about methods and consequences forced Rick to consider long-term implications of his choices, while also providing him with reminders of what he was trying to protect through successful completion of his hunt. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation between Rick Cohn, 37, and Rick Prime, but more importantly, the preparation period had revealed the extent to which both participants had been shaped by decades of multiversal conflict and exposure to forms of power and responsibility that transcended normal human categories, while retaining enough connection to their original personalities and motivations to make their conflict simultaneously personal and cosmic in its scope and implications for everyone whose lives intersected with their activities and choices. The convergence of forces that would finally bring Rick Prime within reach of the justice that had eluded Rick Cohn, 37, for over 3 decades began not with careful strategic planning or systematic application of advanced technology, but with the unexpected intervention of evil Morty, whose own escape from the central finite curve had provided him with knowledge and capabilities that exceeded anything either Rick had previously encountered or imagined possible within the established frameworks of multiversal civilization and interdimensional conflict. The alliance that formed between these 3 beings was born not from trust or shared moral values, but from mutual recognition that Rick Prime represented a threat to all of them that transcended their previous antagonisms and philosophical differences about the nature of power, responsibility, and the proper relationship between superior intelligence and moral obligation. Evil Morty's reappearance in Rick Cohn, 37's reality was accomplished through technological methods that demonstrated his transformation during his time beyond the dimensional barriers that had previously confined multiversal Rick civilization to carefully curated realities, where Rick's intellectual superiority was guaranteed, and his moral flexibility was never challenged by exposure to beings whose capabilities might exceed his own. The knowledge and resources that evil Morty had acquired during his exploration of the unrestricted multiverse included not just advanced technology, but also sophisticated understanding of Rick's psychology and behavioral patterns that enabled him to predict and manipulate even the most paranoid and strategically sophisticated versions of Rick Sanchez. The intelligence that evil Morty provided about Rick Prime's location and defensive capabilities was not offered through altruistic desire to assist Rick Cohn, 37's quest for justice, but rather through calculated assessment of strategic advantages that could be gained through temporary collaboration with someone whose hatred for Rick Prime aligned with evil Morty's own objectives, while also providing opportunities to study and potentially exploit Rick Cohn, 37's psychological vulnerabilities and technological resources. The cooperation was genuine but limited, based on shared enemies rather than common values or mutual respect. The tracking technology that Rick Cone 37 had developed through years of patient investigation and systematic analysis of dimensional signatures was enhanced by Evil Morty's contributions in ways that finally made it possible to penetrate Rick Prime's sophisticated defensive systems and locate his actual position rather than the decoys and false signals that had frustrated previous hunting efforts. The breakthrough required not just technological innovation but also collaborative application of different approaches to problem solving that neither participant could have achieved working alone, despite their identical intellectual capabilities and extensive experience with multiversal conflict. The dimensional coordinates that their enhanced tracking systems identified as Rick Prime's actual location led to a reality that had been systematically stripped of its original population and transformed into a massive industrial complex designed to support Rick Prime's ongoing projects and provide him with unlimited resources for continued experimentation and technological development. The scale of the operation exceeded anything that individual genius should have been able to accomplish, revealing that Rick Prime had developed methods for exploiting entire civilizations and planetary ecosystems in pursuit of objectives that served only his own psychological needs and intellectual curiosity. The approach to Rick Prime's stronghold required careful coordination between Rick Cone 37, Morty, and Evil Morty, as the defensive systems that protected the installation were designed not just to eliminate intruders, but to provide Rick Prime with advance warning of any intrusion attempts, while also gathering intelligence about the capabilities and methods of anyone foolish enough to challenge his security. The automated weapons and surveillance networks that surrounded his laboratory represented applications of advanced technology that pushed the boundaries of what dimensional physics and energy manipulation could achieve when applied, without ethical constraints or concern for collateral damage. The initial assault on Rick Prime's defenses revealed the full extent of his technological superiority and strategic preparation, as the systems he had developed to protect his stronghold demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything Rick Cone 37 had previously encountered during his years of multiversal adventure and conflict with dangerous, alternate versions of himself. The weapons that Rick Prime deployed against his attackers were not just designed for elimination but also for psychological warfare, creating experiences of terror and helplessness that would maximize suffering while demonstrating his absolute dominance over anyone who dared to challenge his authority. Rick Prime's personal appearance in the main chamber of his laboratory was orchestrated with theatrical precision that transformed their confrontation from simple conflict into performance designed to showcase his superior evolution and technological capabilities, while also providing him with opportunities to conduct psychological warfare against opponents whose emotional vulnerabilities and moral constraints he understood intimately. The casual confidence with which he greeted his attackers revealed his assessment that the outcome of their encounter was predetermined, regardless of their preparation or collaborative advantages. The psychological warfare that Rick Prime conducted during their initial confrontation was designed not just to gain tactical advantages, but also to demonstrate his sophisticated understanding of Rick Cone 37's motivations and emotional triggers, while highlighting the fundamental differences between their approaches to power, responsibility, and the proper response to trauma and loss. The taunts and revelations that Rick Prime delivered were calculated to create maximum psychological impact, while also revealing information about his own methods and objectives that would make his eventual defeat more satisfying for his opponents. The revelation that Rick Prime had developed technology capable of eliminating specific individuals from every possible reality simultaneously was not just demonstration of his superior scientific capabilities, but also evidence of his evolution toward forms of cosmic-scale evil that transcended normal categories of criminal behavior or mental illness. The Omega device that he had used to erase every Diane from the multiverse represented the ultimate expression of his nihilistic worldview and his conviction that superior intelligence justified unlimited moral flexibility in pursuit of personal satisfaction and philosophical consistency. The battle that ensued between Rick Prime and his attackers was conducted on multiple levels simultaneously, as physical conflict was accompanied by technological warfare involving dimensional manipulation and energy weapons that exceeded anything previously witnessed within multiversal Rick civilization. The combat revealed not just differences in technological capabilities, but also fundamental philosophical disagreements about the nature of power and its proper application in contexts where unlimited resources made normal moral constraints seem arbitrary and constraining. Rick Prime's elimination of Slow Mobius during the confrontation was designed not just to cause emotional pain to Rick Cone 37, but also to demonstrate his willingness to destroy anything his opponents valued as means of gaining psychological advantages and asserting his dominance over beings whose emotional investments and moral commitments he viewed as fundamental weaknesses that could be exploited through systematic application of superior intelligence and technological capability. The turning point in their battle came through Evil Morty's strategic deception, rather than superior firepower or technological innovation, as he exploited Rick Prime's overconfidence and his tendency to underestimate beings he classified as intellectually inferior by successfully impersonating Morty Cone 37 and gaining close enough proximity to deploy weapons that Rick Prime's defensive systems were not configured to counter effectively. The success of the deception revealed both Evil Morty's sophisticated understanding of Rick's psychology and Rick Prime's blindness to threats that did not conform to his expectations about multiversal conflict patterns. The moment when Evil Morty successfully incapacitated Rick Prime represented not just tactical victory, but also symbolic reversal of the power dynamic that had characterized their relationship since Evil Morty's original appearance as apparent victim of Rick's systematic exploitation and abuse. The tables had turned completely, with the supposed victim revealing capabilities that exceeded those of his former tormentor, while also demonstrating strategic thinking that had anticipated and countered every defensive measure that Rick Prime's paranoia and technological sophistication had developed. Evil Morty's decision to extract Rick Prime's memories and technological knowledge before allowing Rick Cone 37 to complete his revenge was motivated not by desire to assist with justice, but by recognition that Rick Prime's accumulated knowledge represented resources that could be used to prevent other Ricks from achieving similar levels of destructive capability, while also advancing Evil Morty's own objectives in the unrestricted multiverse beyond the central finite curve. The brain extraction process was conducted with clinical efficiency that revealed Evil Morty's complete emotional detachment from Rick Prime's suffering, while also demonstrating technological capabilities that exceeded anything Rick Prime had achieved despite his decades of advanced research and unlimited resources. The reversal was complete. The being who had once been victimized by Rick's casual cruelty had evolved into something more dangerous and sophisticated than any Rick had ever become. The final gift that Evil Morty provided to Rick Cone 37 was not just the opportunity to complete his decades-long quest for revenge, but also the psychological burden of confronting Rick Prime as a helpless victim. rather than a dangerous opponent, forcing Rick to acknowledge that his enemy was ultimately just another version of himself who had made different choices about how to respond to trauma and unlimited power. The recognition that Rick Prime was not a cosmic force of evil, but simply another broken person seeking meaning through destruction, made the act of killing him simultaneously more personal and more meaningless. The moment when evil Morty departed, leaving Rick Cone 37 alone with the incapacitated Rick Prime, represented the culmination of decades of preparation and the beginning of the most psychologically difficult challenge Rick had ever faced. The actual completion of his revenge against someone who was no longer capable of resistance or retaliation. The victory was hollow before it was even achieved, as the elimination of a helpless victim could never provide the satisfaction that defeating a dangerous opponent might have offered. The stage was set for Rick Cone 37's final confrontation with the being who had defined his existence for over 30 years. But the circumstances of their encounter had been arranged to maximize psychological complexity rather than simple satisfaction, ensuring that victory would bring not closure, but rather new forms of existential questioning about identity, purpose, and the ultimate meaninglessness of revenge as source of meaning and direction in lives that had transcended normal human limitations and moral categories. The room where Rick Prime lay helpless and broken bore witness to the convergence of forces that had shaped the multiverse for decades. As Rick Cone 37 stood over the incapacitated form of his greatest enemy, with hands that trembled not from fear or uncertainty, but from the weight of emotions that no amount of scientific training or interdimensional experience had prepared him to process or control. The moment that should have represented the ultimate triumph of justice over evil was instead characterized by profound emptiness and psychological disorientation that revealed the extent to which Rick's entire sense of identity, purpose had been constructed around the pursuit of an objective that could never provide the satisfaction or closure he had spent 30 years believing it would deliver. The physical act of Rick Prime's destruction was conducted not with the sophisticated weapons and advanced technology that had characterized their previous conflicts, but through the most primitive and personal form of violence that Rick Cone 37 could inflict upon someone who had taken everything he had ever loved and transformed it into fuel for cosmic-scale hatred and systematic revenge. The choice to beat Rick Prime to death with his bare hands was not strategic or practical, but rather psychological, representing Rick's desperate attempt to achieve some form of cathartic release through direct physical engagement with the source of his decades-long trauma and obsession. Rick Prime's consciousness during his final moments was not characterized by fear or regret, but by a form of cold satisfaction that transcended his physical suffering, as he recognized that his ultimate victory over Rick Cone 37 was not preventing his own death, but rather ensuring that his killer would discover the meaninglessness of revenge and the psychological emptiness that awaited anyone who had structured their entire existence around hatred and the pursuit of objectives that could never justify the sacrifices required for their achievement. The dying Rick's final words were not pleas for mercy, but rather philosophical observations about the nature of meaning and identity that were designed to inflict maximum psychological damage, even as his own life ended. The gradual realization that Rick Prime's death provided no emotional relief or psychological satisfaction was perhaps more devastating to Rick Cone 37 than any physical torture or technological warfare he had endured during their decades of conflict, as it forced him to confront the reality that his transformation from loving family man into cosmic-scale predator had been motivated not by pursuit of justice, but by psychological needs that could never be satisfied through external achievements or the elimination of enemies. The emptiness that flooded through him as Rick Prime's body became still, was not temporary disappointment, but permanent recognition that he had sacrificed everything meaningful in pursuit of goals that were fundamentally hollow. The blood on Rick Cone 37's hands served as physical reminder of the violence he had committed and the moral boundaries he had crossed during his evolution from victim to victimizer, but it also symbolized the irreversible nature of choices that had transformed him into someone who was no longer recognizably the same person who had once been motivated by love for Diane and Beth, rather than hatred for their killer. The man who had beaten Rick Prime to death was not the same Rick who had refused portal technology in favor of family obligations, but rather someone who had been shaped by decades of systematic moral compromise and psychological damage. The recognition that Rick Prime's predictions about the aftermath of successful revenge were accurate created forms of existential crisis that exceeded anything Rick Cone 37 had experienced during his years of multiversal conflict and exposure to cosmic-scale threats that challenged normal human categories of understanding and moral reasoning. The discovery that his enemy had possessed superior insight into the psychological consequences of their conflict was more disturbing than any physical victory Rick Prime might have achieved through technological superiority or strategic planning. The philosophical implications of Rick Prime's final observations about identity and meaning were not abstract intellectual puzzles, but rather concrete challenges to every assumption and rationalization that Rick Cone 37 had used to justify his transformation from protective family member into someone whose approach to problem-solving had become indistinguishable from the methods employed by the monster he had spent decades hunting. The possibility that his entire quest for revenge had been orchestrated by Rick Prime as form of long-term psychological warfare exceeded paranoia to approach genuine insight into the nature of their relationship. The immediate aftermath of Rick Prime's death was characterized not by celebration or relief, but by profound silence that seemed to encompass not just the laboratory where the killing had occurred, but the entire structure of meaning and purpose that had organized Rick Cone 37's existence since the day his original family had been murdered. The absence of Rick Prime from the multiverse created a vacuum that revealed how completely Rick's sense of identity had been defined by opposition to his enemy, rather than commitment to positive values or constructive objectives. The psychological evaluation that Rick Cone 37 conducted of his own mental state following Rick Prime's elimination revealed the extent to which his decades-long quest for revenge had systematically eliminated his Prime's end of fist capacity for the kinds of relationships and emotional investments that had once provided his life with direction and satisfaction. The love he felt for Morty and his adopted family was genuine, but was also contaminated by the same psychological patterns and behavioral frameworks that had enabled his transformation into someone capable of systematic violence and casual disregard for the welfare of anyone outside his immediate circle. The recognition that Rick Prime's death had not restored Rick Cone 37's capacity for normal human emotional responses or moral reasoning was accompanied by growing awareness that the psychological damage he had sustained during his evolution toward cosmic scale predation might be irreversible regardless of his intellectual understanding of its causes and consequences. The man who had once been motivated by protective love had become someone whose primary relationship with other beings was instrumental rather than authentic, treating even his closest family members as sources of psychological stability rather than autonomous individuals, deserving of respect and consideration. The empty throne that Rick Prime's elimination had created within the hierarchy of multiversal threats was not filled by Rick Cone 37's assumption of similar power and influence, but rather remained vacant as evidence that the cycle of violence and revenge that had characterized their conflict had produced no meaningful resolution or improvement in the overall structure of interdimensional civilization. The death of the multiverse's most dangerous Rick had not made reality safer or more just, but had simply removed one source of systematic cruelty, while leaving intact all the conditions and psychological patterns that had enabled his rise to cosmic-scale significance. The technological legacy that Rick Prime left behind included not just advanced weapons and dimensional manipulation devices, but also philosophical frameworks and behavioral models that would continue to influence other Ricks long after their originator's physical elimination. The ideas and methods that Rick Prime had developed during his evolution toward cosmic-scale evil were not dependent on his continued existence for their propagation and implementation by other beings whose psychological development might follow similar trajectories under comparable circumstances. The broader implications of Rick Prime's death for multiversal Rick civilization were unclear but potentially destabilizing, as his elimination removed both a major threat and a unifying enemy that had provided other Ricks with common purpose and collaborative objectives that transcended their normal tendencies toward isolation and mutual competition. The absence of Rick Prime from the political and technological landscape of interdimensional society created opportunities for new forms of conflict and cooperation that could not be predicted through analysis of previous patterns and historical precedents. The personal consequences of Rick Prime's death for Rick Cone 37 extended beyond immediate psychological impact to encompass fundamental questions about how he would spend the remainder of his existence now that his primary objective had been achieved, and his sense of purpose had been revealed as fundamentally hollow. The capabilities and knowledge he had acquired during his decades-long hunt for Rick Prime remained intact, but were no longer organized around clear goals or meaningful applications that could provide direction for future activities and choices. The relationship between Rick Cone 37 and Morty was inevitably affected by the completion of their shared quest for revenge against Rick Prime, as the collaborative bond that had developed around their mutual commitment to hunting and eliminating their family's killer was no longer necessary or sustainable without the external threat that had justified their partnership in systematic violence and morally questionable activities. The grandfather and grandson would need to discover new forms of connection and shared purpose that did not depend on common enemies or collaborative predation. The family dynamics that had been shaped by years of Rick Cone 37's obsession with revenge against Rick Prime would require fundamental reorganization now that his primary motivation and source of identity had been eliminated through successful completion of his quest. The protective relationships and emotional investments that had sustained him during his darkest periods might prove insufficient for providing meaning and direction in circumstances where his capabilities were no longer needed for defense against existential threats. The recognition that Rick Cone 37 had become more similar to Rick Prime than different from him during their decades of conflict created moral and psychological challenges that could not be resolved through technological innovation or strategic planning, but would require forms of emotional honesty and personal accountability that his evolution toward cosmic-scale predation had systematically eliminated from his behavioral repertoire and psychological capabilities. The stage was set for Rick Cone 37's most difficult challenge, learning to exist without the revenge motivation that had structured his identity and provided direction for his activities during the most formative period of his adult life, while also confronting the reality that his transformation into someone capable of systematic violence and casual disregard for moral constraints had been neither necessary nor inevitable, but had resulted from choices that could not be undone through regret or technological solutions. The silence that settled over the multiverse following Rick Prime's elimination was not the peaceful quiet of resolution, but rather the profound emptiness that accompanies the removal of forces so fundamentally destructive that their absence reveals the full scope of damage they inflicted, not just through their actions, but through their very existence as possibilities that reality had somehow allowed to manifest and flourish. Rick Prime's story stands as perhaps the most complete cautionary tale ever written across infinite dimensions about the relationship between unlimited intellectual capability and moral development, demonstrating with mathematical precision how genius without wisdom, power without purpose, and infinite possibility without meaningful connection inevitably lead to forms of evil that transcend normal human categories of understanding, while retaining enough recognizable humanity to make their choices both comprehensible and horrifying. The legacy that Rick Prime left behind extends far beyond the immediate victims of his multiversal genocide and systematic psychological warfare to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, creativity, and moral responsibility that affect every conscious being, whose capabilities exceed normal limitations, while whose emotional and ethical development remains constrained by the same psychological patterns and vulnerabilities that shaped Rick Prime's transformation from loving family member into cosmic-scale predator, whose primary relationship with existence was through its systematic destruction and manipulation. The philosophical frameworks that Rick Prime developed to justify his evolution toward absolute evil were not arbitrary rationalizations designed to make himself feel better about choices he knew to be wrong, but rather represented genuine attempts to construct coherent worldviews that could accommodate his intellectual capabilities, while eliminating the emotional constraints and moral obligations that he found incompatible with unlimited individual freedom and cosmic-scale autonomy. The terrifying aspect of his philosophical development was not its internal inconsistency, but rather its logical coherence and systematic application of principles that could be embraced by anyone whose psychological needs and intellectual capabilities aligned with similar patterns of development. The technological achievements that Rick Prime accomplished during his decades of multiversal activity represented genuine advances in scientific knowledge and engineering capability that expanded the boundaries of what conscious beings could achieve through systematic application of intelligence and resources, but they also demonstrated how advanced capabilities could be applied in service of objectives that served no constructive purpose beyond the satisfaction of psychological needs that normal forms of meaning and relationship had been unable to address adequately. The relationships that Rick Prime systematically destroyed through his actions and choices were not just individual connections between specific people, but rather represented entire categories of human experience and moral possibility that his existence eliminated from the multiverse through targeted application of advanced technology, guided by philosophical frameworks that classified love, commitment, and emotional vulnerability as obstacles to be overcome rather than values to be protected and nurtured. But perhaps most significantly, Rick Prime's story serves as a reminder that the capacity for transformation into something approaching pure evil exists as potential within beings whose intellectual and creative capabilities exceed normal limitations, and that the development of advanced technology and sophisticated philosophical frameworks does not automatically produce corresponding advances in wisdom, empathy, or moral reasoning that might prevent such capabilities from being applied in service of objectives that threaten the welfare and continued existence of everyone whose lives intersect with their activities and choices. The multiverse that continues to exist following Rick Prime's elimination is not fundamentally different from the reality he inhabited and shaped through his actions, as the same conditions and possibilities that enabled his evolution toward cosmic-scale predation remain available to other beings whose psychological development might follow similar trajectories when exposed to unlimited power and infinite possibility without corresponding development of wisdom and moral sophistication that could provide direction and constraint for their increasingly ambitious activities and experiments. The peace that comes from understanding Rick Prime's story is not the comfort of knowing that such monsters can be defeated through sufficient determination and collaborative effort, but rather the deeper tranquility that emerges from recognizing that even the most terrifying possibilities that infinite reality contains remain comprehensible as extensions of ordinary human psychology and moral choice, rather than representing alien forces that exceed human understanding or capability for response and resistance. Rest now, knowing that unlike Rick Prime, your existence unfolds within contexts where relationships matter, where choices carry moral weight that cannot be eliminated through sophisticated rationalization, and where the love and commitment that he systematically destroyed remain the most powerful forces for meaning and purpose that consciousness has discovered across infinite possibilities and unlimited potential for both creation, destruction that characterize the endless expanse of multiversal existence, where every story eventually finds both its beginning and its ending in the simple recognition that connection transcends individual achievement and that meaning emerges not from power but from the courage to remain vulnerable to loss and committed to values that extend beyond personal advantage and cosmic scale ambition. Sweet dreams in this singular, precious reality where even monsters like Rick Prime serve ultimately to illuminate the beauty and significance of ordinary love, family bonds, and moral commitments that make existence meaningful. Despite its apparent fragility and the constant possibility that everything we value could be destroyed by forces beyond our control or understanding, but where the choice to continue loving and protecting what matters remains available regardless of the threats and challenges that unlimited possibility might generate, or the forms of evil that advanced intelligence might create when it abandons wisdom and compassion in favor of individual transcendence and absolute autonomy that promises everything but delivers only emptiness, and the recognition that meaning cannot be manufactured through achievement, but must be discovered through relationship and sustained through commitment to values that acknowledge our fundamental dependence on others for everything that makes existence worthwhile and beautiful.